Adrian was not like most people in his world. From a young age, he had always been fascinated by the idea of solving problems with words rather than weapons. While others admired strength and the ability to overpower opponents, Adrian believed that understanding, patience, and careful reasoning could achieve what armies could not. This belief had guided him throughout his life, shaping him into a thoughtful and observant individual. He spent years studying the histories of empires, the outcomes of conflicts, and the stories of leaders who had chosen negotiation over violence. Every detail mattered to him. The tone of a voice, the choice of words, the way someone carried themselves, even the unspoken intentions behind a smile. Adrian's mentors often told him that his patience and intelligence were his greatest weapons. Though many laughed at the idea of diplomacy being more powerful than a fleet of warships, at the age of 29, Adrian was given a mission that would define his life. He was to travel to a distant, hostile planet and negotiate a peace agreement between two rival factions that had been at war for decades. These factions were known across the galaxy for their stubbornness and pride. Each side believed themselves superior, dismissing anything that hinted at compromise. Adrian knew the task would not be easy. He understood that he was walking into a place where his reputation as a diplomat would be tested against centuries of mistrust, resentment, and arrogance. Still, he accepted the challenge, driven by a deep sense of responsibility and the hope that conflict could be avoided. The journey to the planet was long, giving Adrian time to prepare both mentally and emotionally. He studied every report about the factions, learning about their leaders, their customs, and even their biases. He understood that to succeed, he could not rely solely on his words. He had to show respect for their culture while gently guiding them toward an agreement. Alongside his preparation, Adrian thought about the consequences of failure. He knew that if the negotiations collapsed, the war could escalate beyond anyone's control. Thousands, perhaps millions, could suffer as a result. The weight of that thought pressed heavily on him, yet he remained calm, believing that careful preparation and a steady mind could overcome even the greatest hostility. When Adrian arrived on the planet, he was immediately struck by the atmosphere. The capital city was imposing, a sprawling metropolis that reflected the pride and power of its people. The negotiation hall where he would meet the leaders was immense, with towering ceilings and walls adorned with symbols of past victories. As he entered, he felt the eyes of countless officials on him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed mockery. Whispers traveled across the hall, and Adrian could sense the skepticism that surrounded him. These were people who had seen many diplomats fail before, people who were trained to dismiss words that didn't carry the weight of a weapon. Despite the daunting environment, Adrian held his composure, reminding himself that confidence and patience were as important as strategy. The initial interactions were harsh. The leaders of the factions did not hide their disdain. They openly laughed at Adrian's attempts to appeal to reason, calling his efforts naive and unrealistic. Some even mocked his appearance and questioned his experience, implying that someone so young and seemingly gentle could never understand the complexities of their conflict. Adrian could have responded with anger or frustration, but he knew that such reactions would only validate their doubts. Instead, he listened carefully, noting every insult, every sarcastic remark, and every attempt to undermine him. He observed the subtle power dynamics in the room, understanding that patience was his ally. His ability to remain calm in the face of ridicule began to stand out, even if no one acknowledged it yet. Outside of the formal negotiations, Adrian found moments to connect with lesser officials and advisors, people who were not as hardened or cynical as the faction leaders. Through quiet conversations, he gained insights into the fears and hopes of both sides. Some confided their doubts about the ongoing war, sharing stories of lives lost and communities destroyed. Adrian listened with empathy, never judging or offering quick solutions. He realized that these small connections could become the foundation for larger breakthroughs, as people were more willing to listen to someone who showed genuine understanding. Each encounter strengthened his resolve, reminding him that diplomacy was not about immediate victories but about planting seeds that could grow over time. Despite the mockery, Adrian remained strategic. He prepared subtle demonstrations of his people's capabilities, hinting at the resources and power that backed him without threatening outright. He knew that true diplomacy was about creating respect, not fear. But he also understood that respect required credibility. These hints were small. A careful mention here, a reference to successful past negotiations there. But they were enough to make the opposition pause, even if only for a moment. Adrian's approach was methodical. He spoke with sincerity, listened without judgment, and positioned himself as a mediator rather than a challenger. Every word, every gesture was calculated to show strength through restraint rather than aggression. As days passed, Adrian faced growing pressure. Some of his own allies began to doubt his methods, fearing that the ridicule he endured might compromise the mission. Yet Adrian remained steadfast. He drew strength from his belief that the path he had chosen was the right one. He reminded himself that history often favored those who were willing to endure hardship for the sake of peace. Each moment of mockery was an opportunity to reinforce his own patience and to demonstrate that diplomacy was not weakness, but a different kind of strength, one that required courage, foresight, and unwavering commitment. By the end of this first part of his journey, Adrian had earned a subtle, though not yet overt, recognition from some of the observers in the hall. While the faction leaders still laughed, there was a sense that this young diplomat was not entirely ordinary. His calm demeanor, thoughtful responses, and unshakable patience began to plant doubt in the minds of those who had dismissed him outright. Adrian knew that the real challenge lay ahead, that the next stages of negotiation would test him even further, but he also knew that the foundation had been laid. In a room full of laughter and doubt, he had managed to show that diplomacy, when executed with intelligence and patience, was a force that could not be ignored. Adrian entered the negotiation hall with a quiet determination, knowing that the real test of his skills was about to begin. The chamber was enormous, designed to impress and intimidate anyone who dared to enter. Its walls were adorned with banners and trophies of past victories, a clear reminder of the faction's long history of conflict and pride. The leaders were already present, seated on elevated platforms, exuding authority and confidence. As Adrian approached, he felt the weight of their gazes, sharp and assessing, full of doubt and disdain. Every whisper and side glance seemed calculated to unsettle him. Yet he remained composed, understanding that showing even the slightest sign of nervousness would only give them more ammunition to mock his approach. The negotiations began with formal greetings, but it quickly became apparent that these leaders had no intention of treating Adrian as an equal. They interrupted him frequently, laughing at his carefully chosen words, dismissing his proposals, and even ridiculing his attempts to understand their culture and concerns. Some scoffed openly at the very idea of diplomacy, claiming that their people would never respect agreements unless enforced through strength and intimidation. Adrian could feel the tension building in the room, as if the air itself had become heavier with hostility. Each insult and sarcastic remark was a test, and Adrian knew that how he responded would determine whether he could even maintain a foothold in the conversation. Despite the hostility, Adrian did not retaliate. Instead, he listened intently, noting every word, tone, and gesture. He had spent years learning that in negotiations, silence and observation could be as powerful as speech. He observed how the leaders reacted to each other, identifying subtle power struggles and alliances that were not immediately obvious. Some leaders sought to dominate through fear, while others tried to manipulate through charm or cunning. By understanding these dynamics, Adrian began to map a strategy that relied not on confrontation but on patience and insight. He realized that to succeed he could not allow the ridicule to distract him. He had to stay focused on the long-term goal of achieving peace. Adrian's approach was deliberate and calculated. He framed his proposals not as commands or demands but as options that could benefit both sides. He highlighted potential opportunities for mutual gain, using examples and analogies that resonated with the faction's history and values. At the same time, he subtly hinted at the backing of his own people, a powerful fleet and advanced technology capable of overwhelming force if provoked. These hints were never direct threats. They were carefully placed reminders that Adrian represented not just himself, but an entire civilization capable of defending its interests. The laughter in the room did not cease, but a few leaders began to exchange uneasy glances, sensing that there might be truth behind his words. Outside the negotiation hall, Adrian's team worked tirelessly to support him. They monitored communications, analyzed responses, and ensured that every move he made was backed by accurate information. Though Adrian's primary tools were patience, reasoning, and diplomacy, the presence of his team provided a silent layer of security. He knew that if the factions tested the limits of his patience, he would have support waiting to intervene, but he also understood that relying too heavily on that support would undermine his credibility. His goal was to show that intelligence and composure could command respect even in the face of mockery and hostility. As the day progressed, tensions in the hall escalated. The faction leaders became more aggressive, challenging Adrian with sharp questions and provocative statements. They tried to trap him into admitting weaknesses or contradictions, hoping to expose any flaw that could be used to discredit him. Adrian navigated each challenge carefully, answering with clarity and honesty while maintaining a calm tone. He never allowed anger or frustration to enter his voice, and when he sensed an opportunity, he asked questions that subtly encouraged the leaders to reflect on the consequences of ongoing conflict. These questions were not confrontational. They were designed to make the leaders think without realizing they were being guided toward insight. During breaks in the negotiations, Adrian engaged with junior officials and advisors, seeking to understand perspectives that were often overlooked. These conversations provided him with crucial insights into the fears, motivations, and internal pressures faced by the factions. Many of these individuals were tired of war, weary of the destruction and loss that had plagued their communities. Adrian listened without judgment, offering empathy and understanding rather than immediate solutions. By connecting with these people, he was able to build quiet support for his proposals, laying the groundwork for later breakthroughs. He recognized that diplomacy was not just about winning arguments with the top leaders. It was about influencing the broader network of decision-makers and stakeholders who shaped the outcome. Despite the ridicule he faced, Adrian remained confident in his strategy. He understood that patience was more powerful than force in this context, and that mockery was often a sign that his opponents were uncertain or uncomfortable with the possibility of compromise. He used their laughter as a tool, letting it wash over him while observing reactions and noting subtle shifts in body language. Each small pause, each hesitation from a leader, became a clue for how to advance the discussion. Adrian realized that the mockery, though difficult to endure, was also an opportunity to strengthen his position by demonstrating composure, intelligence, and resilience. As the first day of negotiations came to an end, Adrian reflected on the progress made. On the surface, it might have seemed as though little had been accomplished, as the faction leaders continued to dismiss his efforts and mock his approach. But Adrian knew that seeds had been planted. He had established a pattern of calm reasoning and thoughtful observation that set him apart from previous diplomats. He had begun to earn subtle recognition from some of the observers who noted that, despite the hostility, Adrian remained unshaken. His approach had shown that diplomacy required more than words. It required strategy, insight, and the courage to endure ridicule while staying focused on the ultimate goal. The day concluded with a mix of frustration and quiet hope. Adrian understood that the next steps would be even more challenging, as the factions would continue to test his resolve and attempt to exploit any perceived weakness. Yet he also felt a sense of cautious optimism. He had survived the first day, maintained his composure under pressure, and begun to demonstrate that true strength could lie in patience and intelligence rather than brute force. Adrian's belief in the power of diplomacy was not naive. It was tested and strengthened by every insult, every doubt, and every challenge he faced. He knew that the path ahead would demand even greater skill and resilience, but he was prepared to navigate it with determination, careful observation, and unwavering commitment to peace. In the quiet moments after leaving the negotiation hall, Adrian thought about the leader's laughter and the challenges that awaited him. He knew that ridicule was often the first response to something unfamiliar or threatening, and he took it as a sign that his approach was beginning to have an effect. The task ahead would require every ounce of patience, every insight he had gained from years of study, and every connection he had made with allies and observers. But Adrian was ready. He had entered the hostile world of diplomacy, not with weapons but with intelligence, empathy, and strategy. And even though the faction leaders continued to laugh at his methods, Adrian understood that the true power of diplomacy often revealed itself only over time, when the consequences of choice became impossible to ignore. Adrian knew that the most crucial phase of the negotiations was about to begin. The first day had been a test of endurance and patience, and now he had to move beyond mere words and polite diplomacy to shape a path toward genuine dialogue. The faction leaders were still wary, still laughing at his ideas and subtly mocking his approach, but Adrian had already sensed the first cracks in their dismissive attitudes. He understood that real influence came not from shouting louder than the opposition or threatening with empty promises, but from creating an environment where his proposals could be considered seriously, even by those who initially scoffed at them. With that in mind, Adrian prepared himself for a delicate balance of persuasion, subtle strategy, and quiet observation. Outside the negotiation hall, Adrian's team was already in motion. While the leaders argued inside, his fleet had been positioning itself discreetly in orbit around the planet. No sensors had detected the ships yet, and no alarms had been triggered. The fleet was massive, far more powerful than any of the factions could imagine, but Adrian made sure this remained unseen. His goal was not intimidation at this stage. It was leverage. Knowing that he had this strength in reserve gave Adrian a calm assurance that allowed him to negotiate without fear. He could remain composed in the face of ridicule because he understood that his quiet power would eventually speak louder than any insult hurled by the leaders. Inside the hall, tensions had grown sharper. The faction leaders were becoming increasingly aggressive in their statements, trying to corner Adrian with pointed accusations and unrealistic demands. They assumed that his silence and measured responses were signs of weakness, proof that their laughter and hostility were effective. Yet Adrian remained patient. Every question he answered was carefully crafted to maintain balance. He acknowledged their concerns, showed understanding of their frustrations, and framed his ideas as mutually beneficial. He avoided direct confrontation, knowing that an angry rebuttal would only escalate hostilities. Instead, he relied on careful phrasing and an almost imperceptible confidence in his demeanor. Adrian began to subtly hint at the potential power behind him. He did not openly threaten the factions, but his words contained layers of meaning. He spoke of past successes his people had achieved through careful strategy and coordination, never describing them as acts of violence, but highlighting outcomes that demonstrated strength. He emphasized the capacity to protect and enforce agreements, creating a sense that any disregard for his proposals could carry consequences, even if those consequences remained undefined. Some leaders dismissed these comments at first, but others paused, glancing at one another with expressions of uncertainty. Even a small flicker of doubt was progress. Adrian understood that influence often began with the seed of hesitation. Throughout the day, Adrian maintained a careful watch over the body language and subtle reactions of the leaders. Some began to lean forward when he spoke, listening more closely than before. Others exchanged private murmurs, casting glances that suggested they were reconsidering their assumptions about this young diplomat. Adrian noted which arguments seemed effective, which phrases triggered defensive responses, and which examples caused the room to fall silent for even a few moments. Every detail was crucial. He understood that diplomacy was a game of perception as much as logic, and controlling the narrative required him to stay several steps ahead in both planning and execution. In private, Adrian also made sure to strengthen connections with mid-level officials and advisors. Many of these individuals had grown weary of endless conflict, having lost family, homes, and communities to decades of war. They were often overlooked by the faction leaders who focused on power and dominance, but Adrian recognized their value. By speaking with them, listening to their concerns, and demonstrating genuine empathy, he built subtle alliances that could later influence the leaders. These quiet conversations were critical, as they provided insights into the fears and desires that the top leaders might not express openly. Adrian knew that peace often required aligning multiple layers of influence, not just convincing a few stubborn figures at the top. The environment in the hall was tense, but Adrian's calmness contrasted sharply with the agitation of the factions. While they argued and gestured angrily, he remained steady, answering questions thoughtfully and redirecting conversations toward constructive solutions. His ability to remain unshaken under constant mockery was beginning to earn him a measure of respect, though unspoken and not yet acknowledged openly. The factions were slowly realizing that this young diplomat was not easily rattled, and that his calm presence suggested both intelligence and confidence. They did not yet understand the full extent of the power supporting him, but they were starting to sense that Adrian's patience was itself a force to be reckoned with. Adrian's strategy also included timing and subtle pauses. He knew that people often reveal their true intentions when they feel impatient or frustrated. By allowing moments of silence after particularly pointed statements, he created small opportunities for reflection. Some leaders began to fidget, others exchanged uneasy looks, and a few even hesitated before responding. These tiny reactions were invaluable, as they indicated that his words were beginning to penetrate the veneer of arrogance and certainty. Adrian understood that influence did not require domination, only the ability to guide perception and thought carefully. Step by step, as the negotiations continued, Adrian began to weave together ideas from both factions, presenting proposals that highlighted shared interests and common goals. He carefully avoided framing them as compromises that favored one side over the other, instead emphasizing mutual benefit and long-term stability. This approach challenged the factions' traditional ways of thinking, which focused on winning at any cost. Some leaders resisted, insisting that any suggestion of compromise was weakness. Yet Adrian patiently reframed arguments, showing that collaboration could achieve outcomes that individual power alone never could. The process was slow, painstaking, and often met with frustration, but Adrian knew that meaningful progress was rarely immediate. By the end of the third day, subtle changes were noticeable. The faction's mockery had lessened slightly, replaced by moments of genuine engagement. Some leaders asked questions with curiosity rather than condescension. Others sought clarification on specific proposals, indicating that they were beginning to consider the practicality of Adrian's suggestions. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible, but Adrian recognized it for what it was, a sign that his strategy was beginning to work. Patience, careful observation, and thoughtful communication were starting to break through decades of distrust and pride. Throughout this period, Adrian also remained mindful of his own mental and emotional balance. Diplomacy in such a hostile environment could easily lead to frustration, fatigue, or overreaction. He practiced mindfulness, focusing on his breathing and the clarity of his thoughts. He reminded himself that the faction's mockery was not personal. It was a predictable response to someone who challenged their assumptions. By maintaining internal calm, he preserved his ability to respond strategically rather than react emotionally, ensuring that every word and gesture advanced his mission rather than undermined it. As the day drew to a close, Adrian reflected on the progress made. The leaders were still difficult, still prone to mockery, but subtle changes indicated that they were beginning to recognize his resolve and intelligence. He had managed to maintain control of the dialogue, subtly influence perceptions, and strengthen connections with allies who could affect the outcome. His preparation, patience, and ability to read people were paying off. The real challenge remained ahead, as the factions would continue to test his limits and the full strength he represented had yet to be revealed. Yet Adrian felt a quiet confidence. He had navigated the tense environment with skill and insight, proving that diplomacy backed by intelligence, patience, and subtle strategy could achieve what force alone could not. Even in the face of ridicule and hostility, Adrian's calm presence had begun to create doubt in the minds of the faction leaders. They did not yet understand the full extent of the power behind him, nor did they realize that his patience and insight were weapons in themselves. The stage was now set for the next phase of the negotiations, where subtle influence would begin to transform into tangible leverage. Adrian knew that the key to success lay not in immediate victories but in careful, deliberate actions that would gradually reshape perceptions, build respect, and ultimately lead to the possibility of real peace. By the time Adrian left the hall that evening, he felt the first signs of hope. The journey was far from over and challenges remained, but he had demonstrated that diplomacy, intelligence, and unwavering composure could command attention even in the most hostile environments. The process of change was slow, often imperceptible, but Adrian understood that meaningful transformation required time, patience, and strategic insight. As he prepared for the next day, he knew that his careful observation, thoughtful communication, and subtle influence would continue to shape the negotiations, slowly but surely guiding the factions toward a resolution they could respect. The day began like any other in the tense negotiations, but Adrian knew that everything was about to change. Up until now, his approach had relied entirely on patience, subtle strategy, and careful observation. He had endured ridicule, ignored mocking laughter, and slowly begun to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the faction leaders. But the true turning point was approaching, the moment when diplomacy would meet undeniable power, and the factions would finally understand the seriousness of Adrian's position. Outside the negotiation hall, the massive fleet that Adrian had carefully kept hidden for days was moving into position. These were not ordinary ships. They were the deadliest vessels ever built, engineered with advanced technology, precision weapons, and defensive systems far beyond anything the factions had encountered. Yet they were not yet visible, for Adrian understood that timing and perception were as crucial as firepower. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The leaders were still exchanging sharp words, still attempting to undermine Adrian with mockery and sarcasm. They laughed at the idea that his people could pose any threat, assuming that diplomacy alone could never be backed by force. Adrian listened quietly, taking careful note of each leader's expression, each subtle movement, and each gesture of confidence or doubt. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the escalating aggression in the room. While they shouted and argued, he remained composed, carefully choosing the right moments to speak, to pause, and to guide the discussion in ways that they could not fully resist. He knew that influence often came from control, not chaos, and that the factions would eventually notice the shift without realizing the full reason why. Then, the first sign appeared. A subtle vibration ran through the floor of the negotiation hall, barely noticeable at first. Some leaders paused, confused, glancing at one another, trying to understand what had caused it. Adrian kept his composure, acknowledging nothing, speaking with his usual calm precision. The vibration grew slightly stronger, enough to catch the attention of everyone present. A low, resonating hum began to fill the chamber, a sound that was alien, deep, and almost alive. It was unlike anything the factions had heard before. Whispers spread through the room. Some officials exchanged anxious looks, their laughter dying on their lips. The mocking tone in the room began to fade as the sound grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the massive chamber. Adrian continued speaking, calmly weaving his arguments with quiet authority. But now the factions were distracted. Their eyes were drawn to the distant horizon outside the hall's transparent observation windows, though the source of the sound was still unseen. The hum intensified, a deep vibrating presence that seemed to reverberate in the chest and bones of everyone in the room. Leaders who had been so confident moments before were beginning to shift in their seats, their expressions changing from smugness to unease. The sound carried with it an unspoken message. Adrian's people were not just words, they were backed by power beyond imagination. The factions had always dismissed diplomacy as weak, but now the reality of that judgment was crashing into their awareness. Outside, the deadliest ship of Adrian's fleet had begun its approach, gliding silently through the planet's upper atmosphere. Its sheer size was unimaginable, a behemoth of metal and energy designed to command attention and respect. It moved with precision, every system operational, every weapon calibrated, but there was no aggression in its display, only presence. The ship itself was a warning, a symbol that Adrian's words were not empty, that the power supporting him was both real and fully capable of destruction. Sensors from the faction leaders' facilities began to detect anomalies, and murmurs spread among their ranks as technicians scrambled to interpret what they were seeing. Fear began to replace laughter, and the room in the negotiation hall felt the shift like a wave passing through the crowd. As the ship drew nearer, Adrian subtly increased the intensity of his discussion. He referenced past accomplishments, the successes of his people in resolving conflicts without unnecessary bloodshed, and the capability to defend and enforce agreements if needed. The leaders tried to continue their arguments, but their voices faltered. Every insult, every mocking remark that had once filled the room was now replaced with tense silence and uncertain glances. The juxtaposition was striking. Adrian remained, calm, almost serene, while the factions struggled to maintain their composure under the growing realization of the threat. The ship had become a tangible representation of the consequences they had so far ignored. and it spoke louder than any word he could have uttered. Inside the hall, some of the leaders attempted to regain control, issuing commands and checking communications, but the sense of panic was already spreading. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by fear, and even the most hardened officials were beginning to recognize the gravity of the situation. The hum of the ship seemed to grow louder with each passing minute, a reminder that this was not a bluff. The factions were no longer dealing with a diplomat they could mock. They were dealing with someone whose words were reinforced by overwhelming power. The laughter that had defined the initial meetings vanished entirely, replaced by nervous murmurs and tense anticipation. Adrian's calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos forming around him, and it only magnified the credibility of his presence. The Deadliest ship now hovered in clear view, its immense structure casting shadows over the city below. Its design was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, engineered to demonstrate precision, strength, and advanced technology. The factions could no longer deny the truth. Adrian's warnings had been accurate, his hints of power real. The mockery that had defined their previous interactions seemed foolish in comparison to the reality unfolding before them. They were witnessing firsthand the intersection of diplomacy and unmatched force, and it changed everything. Every negotiation tactic they had relied on, every insult and scoff suddenly felt inadequate and dangerous. The perception of weakness that had allowed them to laugh at Adrian had been replaced by a stark understanding of the potential consequences. At this moment, the entire mood of the negotiation hall shifted. Leaders who had been belligerent were now cautious. The arrogance that had fueled their mockery was replaced with a sober respect, and even the younger officials and aides began to whisper in quiet astonishment. Adrian's calm authority, once questioned, now carried weight beyond words. The presence of the ship, combined with his unwavering demeanor, created a dynamic in which the factions had to reconsider their approach. They understood that further mockery or dismissal could have catastrophic consequences, and that Adrian's patience was not weakness but a deliberate and controlled power. As the hum of the ship filled the chamber, Adrian continued to speak. His tone remained steady, his words carefully crafted to emphasize reason, mutual benefit, and the necessity of cooperation. He did not need to shout, to threaten, or to display aggression. The mere combination of his composure and the undeniable presence of his fleet communicated far more than any speech could. Slowly, questions began to be asked, cautiously, respectfully. The leaders sought clarification, not to challenge him, but to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. The dynamic had completely reversed. The factions who had once mocked diplomacy were now listening, hesitant but attentive, as Adrian guided them through possibilities for resolution. By the end of this part of the story, it was clear that Adrian had achieved what few could have imagined. The factions had moved from ridicule to cautious respect, from arrogance to awareness, all through a combination of careful diplomacy and the presence of overwhelming, controlled power. The sound of the Deadliest ship had changed the conversation entirely. It was a turning point that demonstrated how true influence often requires a blend of intellect, patience, and the ability to reveal strength at the precise moment when it is most effective. Adrian had turned the tables completely, proving that diplomacy backed by credible force could achieve results that neither intimidation alone nor words alone could accomplish. This was the moment where laughter ended and understanding began. The factions had seen the truth, and for the first time they realized that diplomacy, when executed with strategy, patience, and backed by undeniable power, demanded respect. Adrian had not needed to raise a weapon or issue threats. He had simply revealed the weight behind his words, and the impact was immediate and profound. The sound of the Deadliest ship was more than a warning. It was a message, a statement of intent and a demonstration that respect could be earned without violence, though the potential for destruction was unmistakable. The factions would never mock diplomacy in the same way again, for they had experienced firsthand the moment when careful words met unstoppable power, and the balance of the negotiation had been irrevocably shifted. The atmosphere in the negotiation hall had completely changed. The factions that had once mocked Adrian's diplomacy were now quiet, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear, disbelief, and reluctant respect. The sound of the Deadliest ship and its looming presence had shattered their assumptions, forcing them to reconsider not only Adrian's words, but also the reality of the power backing him. The room that had previously echoed with laughter now held a tense, almost reverent silence. For Adrian, this was the moment he had been waiting for, a moment where patience, careful observation, and strategy converged to create an opportunity for real progress. He understood that this shift was fragile. Any wrong word or gesture could undo the gains he had made. Adrian began to speak, his voice calm and measured, carrying authority without aggression. He did not need to threaten or raise his tone, for the demonstration of power outside the hall had already done that. Instead, he focused on emphasizing cooperation, shared interests, and the benefits of ending a conflict that had cost countless lives and resources. He spoke with clarity, weaving together insights he had gathered over the past days, knowledge of internal dynamics, fears, motivations, and subtle alliances. Every word was intentional, aimed at reinforcing trust and illustrating that diplomacy backed by responsibility and restraint could achieve more than brute force alone. The faction leaders listened, their earlier arrogance replaced by a cautious attentiveness. Questions that had previously been rhetorical or intended to undermine Adrian now came as genuine requests for clarification. They asked about potential terms, consequences, and opportunities for collaboration. Adrian answered with transparency, never promising more than he could deliver, but highlighting pathways that were mutually advantageous. He stressed that peace did not mean surrender, and compromise did not mean weakness. Instead, it was an acknowledgement that sustainable stability required thoughtful decisions and collaboration, not continued conflict. Throughout the discussion, Adrian continued to observe the subtle reactions of everyone in the room. He noticed the slight nods of agreement, the thoughtful pauses, and the hesitant but growing curiosity among junior officials and advisors. These small signals were critical. They indicated that the message of respect through controlled power and intelligent diplomacy was resonating beyond just the top leaders. By addressing their concerns and fears with sincerity, Adrian began to turn skepticism into cautious optimism. The environment was shifting from one of hostility to one where dialogue and potential resolution were possible. As negotiations progressed, Adrian introduced specific proposals for cooperation. He suggested practical solutions to end hostilities, create shared initiatives, and rebuild trust. Each proposal was carefully designed to appeal to the faction's values and priorities while maintaining fairness. He highlighted examples of successful agreements in other contexts, demonstrating that compromise and dialogue could produce tangible benefits. The factions, once resistant to any idea of collaboration, began to engage in constructive discussion. What had been impossible the day before now seemed within reach, and the leaders were forced to acknowledge that Adrian's approach, combining diplomacy with measured displays of power, was effective. The tension in the room gradually transformed into a sense of urgency to act responsibly. Leaders who had previously sought to dominate or belittle Adrian now found themselves negotiating seriously, aware that the slightest misstep could have consequences. Adrian capitalized on this shift, guiding the discussions toward concrete commitments. He facilitated dialogue between opposing factions, ensuring that their voices were heard while steering them toward common ground. He emphasized that lasting peace required active engagement from all parties, and that each faction's cooperation was essential for sustainable outcomes. Outside the hall, the presence of Adrian's fleet remained a quiet but powerful reminder of his credibility. It was no longer a threat to be feared, but a symbol of security and enforcement, reinforcing the messages he delivered within the hall. The factions understood that this was not about intimidation or coercion. It was about respect and accountability. The combination of diplomacy and strategic power created a new framework for interaction. Where once dialogue had seemed futile, it now became the most practical and intelligent choice. The leaders, recognizing this, began to take the negotiations seriously, weighing their options with the understanding that cooperation was not only possible, but necessary. As discussions continued, Adrian worked to ensure that agreements were detailed, actionable, and fair. He proposed mechanisms for monitoring compliance, resolving disputes and maintaining communication between the factions. These measures were designed to build trust over time, acknowledging that past conflicts had created deep-seated suspicion. By providing clear frameworks and practical steps, Adrian reassured the factions that commitments would be honored and that peace could be achieved without sacrificing their autonomy or pride. His approach combined logic, empathy, and strategic insight, allowing the leaders to see the tangible benefits of their cooperation. Slowly, but surely, the factions began to sign preliminary agreements. The laughter and mockery of the past were completely gone, replaced by focused attention and serious deliberation. The leaders realized that Adrian had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed a hostile, derisive environment into one of cooperation and constructive engagement. The respect he had earned was not based solely on fear or the power of the fleet, but on the skillful combination of intelligence, patience, and understanding. He had demonstrated that diplomacy, when executed with precision and backed by credibility, could achieve results that brute force alone could never accomplish. Adrian's calm demeanor and strategic patience had also set a precedent for future negotiations. The factions now understood that respect was not granted automatically. It had to be earned through consistent, thoughtful, and principled action. By showing that he could endure ridicule, analyze situations carefully, and guide discussions without aggression, Adrian became a model for how diplomacy could be effective even in the most hostile environments. The leaders began to view him not merely as a young diplomat, but as a figure whose judgment and intelligence demanded recognition. By the end of the negotiation process, a comprehensive agreement had been reached. The factions committed to cease hostilities, collaborate on shared goals, and maintain ongoing communication to resolve future disputes peacefully. The sense of relief and cautious optimism was palpable throughout the hall. The officials, once antagonistic and dismissive, now acknowledged the importance of dialogue and the value of strategic patience. Adrian's success was a testament to the power of calm reasoning, subtle influence, and the careful integration of visible capability without unnecessary aggression. The story concluded with a reflection on the lessons learned. Adrian had proven that respect could be commanded without violence, that influence could be achieved through intelligence and empathy, and that even the most skeptical and hostile audiences could be persuaded when diplomacy was backed by credibility and careful strategy. The factions had learned that dismissing dialogue as weakness was a dangerous mistake, and that listening, understanding, and responding thoughtfully could create outcomes that no amount of aggression could achieve. Adrian left the planet not only having secured peace, but having changed the way the factions thought about negotiation, respect, and the balance of power. In the aftermath, Adrian's reputation grew not because of fear, but because of mastery, of words, observation, patience, and strategy. His work demonstrated that true strength is measured not only by the capacity to destroy, but by the ability to create understanding and maintain stability. The agreements he facilitated were celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy over derision, intelligence over arrogance, and strategy over chaos. The factions, now fully aware of the capabilities and foresight of Adrian and his people, recognized that their previous laughter had been misplaced and that respect had to be earned. Thoughtfully and deliberately, Adrian's journey concluded with a profound sense of fulfillment. He had navigated ridicule, hostility, and deep-rooted conflict to achieve a lasting resolution. The peace he helped create would endure because it was built on understanding, practical agreements, and the quiet, undeniable presence of authority backed by competence. The factions had learned a lesson they would not forget. Diplomacy, when combined with intelligence, patience, and the credibility of strength, could achieve results far beyond what weapons alone could accomplish. Adrian's calm resolve and strategic brilliance had turned mockery into respect, chaos into cooperation, and the threat of conflict into a lasting promise of peace. The experience left Adrian with the knowledge that true leadership is not measured by dominance alone, but by the ability to guide others toward understanding and shared purpose. He had shown that even in the face of skepticism, doubt, and derision, careful observation, patience, and clear thinking could shift perspectives, alter decisions, and save countless lives. By the end of this journey, Adrian's work stood as a testament to the enduring power of diplomacy and the quiet strength of intelligence combined with credibility.